Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
We are, I suppose, finally at the verses towards the end of Parshat Shemot that we've been kind of referencing in advance for quite some time, and now we get to jump into them. And if you think from the beginning that you're going to understand the basic pshat of these verses after the shiur, think again. I'm utterly convinced that neither I nor any sage, living or dead, really knows what's going on in these verses, really knows who the subject and the object is of each verb. Really, if they had certainty over what the subject and object of the verbs were, really understand why the scene is here, and what's actually happening. But that makes it even more interesting to dive into. But I think pshat is very, very elusive here. So where we are is we just finished verse 23 of chapter 4. So verse 23, to go back, is this maybe part 2, as we've discussed, particularly as Larry has offered to rearrange where the verses come in this aliyah. It's once again God speaking to Moshe, once again God anticipating for Moshe what's going to happen when Moshe finally meets Pharaoh. He hasn't met Pharaoh yet, so we're talking they're going to be past tense verbs in this verse, but they're actually super perfect, that this will have taken place, but it hasn't yet. So God says to Moshe, you're going to say to Pharaoh, Va'omar elecha, and I said to you, Pharaoh. He hasn't said it yet, but he will have. Shalach et b'ni v'avdeni, release my son, because Moshe is speaking on God's behalf, and they will serve me. V'tame'ein l'shalcho, and you have refused to send him. Super perfect, or whatever the phrase is, by then you will have already refused. Hinei anochi horeg et bincha b'chorecha. Therefore I, Moshe / God, will eventually slay your firstborn son. Okay. And we dealt with a lot of stuff there, so we're not going to go backward, but we're going to jump into verse 24, unless there are lingering questions about the material that we did last week. Anyone? Okay. So let's read verse 24, a 3-verse section that you could really spend an enormous amount of time trying to break down its potential meaning. Matt, are you at a place where you can read, or are you walking?
Hi. Yeah, I can read.
Okay, great. Pasuk Kaf Daled.
Okay, hold on just a second. I had it a second ago. Vayihi vaderech ba'malon vayif geshehu Adonai v'yivakesh hamito.
Okay.
And it was on the way to the night place, sleeping place, and the Lord God met him and sought to kill him, to slay him.
Good. Tell me about the word "to" in English.
Where?
Well, you said, and it was on the way to the
okay.
place.
All right. But derech b'malon, you're right. No, it's not really there. So, and it was on the way at the night place, I guess.
Whether it's a huge difference, who knows? But just to be precise, the even though prepositions, as you've discussed many times in Hebrew, are pluripotent, can mean many different things. The b either means in or at or by means of, but probably not to. Even though we know there's some kind of a to implied in the verse because there is a traveling. Okay, so I think.
Excuse me. Could b'malon also be sleeping, like a gerund kind of thing? On the way
during the sleeping part.
Sleepingly, something.
Interesting. Like sure. I suppose it's a possibility. Uncleish does not agree. That doesn't mean it's not right. Uncleish turns it into beveit and bevata, like a kind of a house of housing, a house of lodging. So I think the way Matt translated it is, kind of pretty darn good, right? We know what the word Vayehi means. It happened. We know what the word Vaderech means, on the road, on the way. Just notice for some of you grammar nerds, there's no dagesh in the B of Vaderech, even though there normally would be because the previous word ends in a yud. And so we have an ahoy here, and the two trups are conjunctive. So Vahi Vaderech, but the next word is Bamalon because the Bamalon does not follow a word that ends in an ahoy letter. So we know what we think we know what Bamalon means, either at a malon, modern Hebrew, hotel, a lodging place, or a place of overnight rest. The verb lalun in Hebrew means to pass a night. It doesn't necessarily mean to sleep. It means to pass a night. So the reason the word malon in modern Hebrew means a hotel is because it's the place where one passes a night, right? Everett Fox translates that phrase as, now it was on the journey, at the night camp. And he's very precise. He takes the word malon and renders it night camp with a hyphen because he wants to make it very clear that whatever malon means, it has to do with a place and a time, right? And not necessarily what activity is being done there. It's different than the verb lishon, okay? Vayifka shehu Adonai, right? Here's classic biblical Hebrew where the subject follows the verb. So Adonai is the subject of Vayifka shehu. It's vav hayipuch, which means it's a past tense verb that looks like it's in the future. Pagash, meet, confront, come into contact with the suffix he, and God confronted, met him. Doesn't say who the him is, but we can guess it's Moshe. Vayavakesh, and he sought, he requested. Now, the most common way of understanding this is that the subject of the previous verb is a subject of this verb because that's what the antecedent is. And it's another vav hayipuch verb. Looks like it's future tense, it's past tense. And he, God, I wouldn't say he, but it's grammatically he, God sought hamito, the killing of him. If you want to be very precise, in English, we'd probably turn that into an infinitive. God sought to kill him. It's not lehamito, but God sought hamit. There's your gerund. The killing, which killing of him. Okay. Put it all together. The simplest way to understand this very unsimple verb is that as Moshe is returning, we think to Egypt, right? Although, as we've discussed in previous classes, we're not sure exactly where to plot this the scene, that God decides to murder the one that God has just invited to save other people from murder, right? All of that in that verse. Matt.
If I may, the last subject that we heard from is Pharaoh's firstborn son. In the previous sentence, he says, "Now I will slay your firstborn son." So I'm not saying that's what it means here, but there's a bizarre connection.
Right, you're saying that the suffix of him, which is the object of vakesh, is it's dangling, and it doesn't say it explicitly, and the last object was Pharaoh's son. Yeah, right. I mean, I'm guessing that Larry Herman is preparing a comment. Is he even here? Is he here? Larry here today? Yeah.
If he's here, he's preparing.
He's not here. Oh no, he's there. About the order of these chunks of verses, because it doesn't seem like it seems like it more connects backwards to right after verse 20, right? Whereas Vayikach Moshe Mateh V'Elohim Biado, that Moses took the staff and went on his way. Right. It most easily connects to be stitched together to that. Okay. Right. So there's some sort of attempt of pshat in this first verse. Let's see what comments or questions that people have on that verse before we look at Rashi. Barry.
I was also going to agree with Matt, and it refers to the last object was the Pharaoh's son. But I'm concerned here. Most of the God encounters, previous stories, have been in the Basadeh someplace. This is the first encounter inside a place. I wonder whether there's any significance that here God is confronting, but the encounter is indoors rather than out in the Sadeh.
Right. Well, we don't know that it's indoors because we don't know that Malon means a motel as opposed to the place where they encamped, right? So
we're not alone. Not in all encounters previously is one person out someplace. This seems to be implying a place where other people stay also.
Not necessarily. That might be the bias of how we think of a Malon now. I'm not so sure. I think if you took 20 Jews who were experts in Torah and expert movie makers and had them stage the scene, I would guess, I could be wrong, but a majority of them would have the scene be taking place like in or by their own tent. But there's no way of knowing. And you're right. It's not fully exposed in a sadeh, but I'm not sure it's any more public than Jacob's wrestling with the angel. Andrew and then Joanna.
I am just so stuck on Vayivakesh. It's such an odd qualifier. No matter who he's trying to kill, it's just, where do you see anywhere, someone explaining God's actions
I lost you, Andy.
As opposed to just doing something like, sorry. Let me turn my video off. Hopefully that'll help. How does God even signal that he has an intent to kill? So I'm just stuck on it.
Yeah. So it's a good question, right? Really, you could turn that comment, Andy, into the question of what does Vayivakesh mean in this situation, and how similar is it to the way we would use it in modern Hebrew, right? When we use it in modern Hebrew, it's a request, right? It's right. It's a polite request, right? The word bevakasha, meaning you're welcome or please, is a way of saying that I would like this and I need your help with it. So please help me. In a request, I ask this, right? It may and may not be that biblical bet kuf shin means the same kind of implication that I am relying on you to make this happen, right? In modern speech, in English and in Hebrew, if I'm requesting something, it means that I'm not capable of making it happen on my own. If we turn it into sought, which is how some translations work on this verse, it actually has both meanings, because if I've sought to do something, it means that I really wanted to, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I needed your help with it. It means I sought out, I intended to do so, and I did, right? So it may be that the biblical Vayivakesh is more like sought than requested, but it does make us ask such questions. So good. Let's go to Joanna.
Two things. The Shoresh Pei Gimel Shin, just meaning to encounter or to encounter in a tense situation, because I believe that's the same Shoresh that's used in the Jacob and Esav encounter. So this sense of it's not just like, let's have a friendly meeting. Right. And the other thing that's going through my mind with all these dangling pronouns is, who are they referring to? Are they all referring to the same person, or do they switch in the verse? And imagining the scene in my head in terms of, where is Moshe, where is Tzipporah, and where are the kids in a moment at any given second, especially in light of two things. The conversation we already had about when they went on their way and Moses put them on the camels, and then did they stay together or separate? And fascinatingly, I was online for the Parshat HaShavua program with Rabbi Schatz and Rabbi Shapiro this past weekend. And in a timely reference, they were looking in Parshat Yitro at that moment when Yitro gives his advice to Moshe. But to set the scene, Rabbi Shapiro went back and quickly took us through the entire perek. And what screamed out to me in light of this class was 3 times in the introduction to that scene, we are told that Yitro is coming with Zipporah and her children. So highlighting that by that point in time, Moshe was not with his wife and kids. And so when did that separation happen?
Right. All good questions to which I have no great answers. But yes, Yitro makes it very clear that the reunion of Moshe post-Exodus is also with Tzipporah after she had been sent back, as Achar Shilucheha, which has to have taken place after this scene, wherever we put the scene. And of course, Ein Mukdam U'Muchar b'Torah, so things can be out of chronological order in the Torah, but they can't not make chronological sense, right? The bakesh verb, which is going to combine your comment and Andy's, we've talked at times that there are these 2-letter beginnings of roots that create families of verbs that have similar meanings but are not the exact same. And bet kuf shin is one of them, right? So bet kuf is one of them. So bet kuf shin means not bet kuf. Pei, the first thing you said, by Kasheu, Pei Gimel. Pei Gimel is one of those 2-letter roots that creates a family of meanings that are shades of another. So Pei Gimel Ayin, Paga, means to wound or to meet in a intense way, right? So Vayifga b'makom, that's Yaakov meeting God overnight, and there was like an intense encounter between them. Pei Gimel Ayin. Pei Gimel Shin is normally understood as a less intense, more prosaic meeting. It's just like modern Hebrew, a pigisha is a meeting, right? So if we compare Vayifka Shehu to what the verb would have meant had it been Vayifka Ehu, which would have meant like a clash, right? Like 2 rams meeting each other. It almost seems to invite us to imagine this as being a very soft, like, hey, coffee clash, except that what happens here is a moment of very high stakes. So it's almost as if the Rup Vayifka Shehu is soft selling the scene, and there would have been a root in the same family of words that would have might have been more appropriate for what we're actually going to witness between them. Rick.
Matt wanted to add something there to what you were saying.
After you. Oh no, I just wanted to propose. Or to amend my translation to say maybe that God proposed to kill him or threatened to kill him. That way, that answers the question of why can't God do what God wants. So it changes the dynamics of the encounter.
Right. I think I was getting at that. I think propose might be equally good. That's what I was getting at by suggesting sought. Like if I say I sought to do something, it means that was my intention. It doesn't mean that I made a request of someone. It could mean that.
But it sort of implies that it didn't happen. But here, that it wasn't accomplished. But here, if you say he threatened or he warned, then the Lord accomplished.
Right, but he didn't accomplish it. God doesn't accomplish it because
Sure he did. Look at the end result. The circumcision was performed.
Yeah, but what God proposed to do in your reading is to kill him.
That was a threat, which worked. It got the goal. It reminded him, hey, you haven't circumcised your kid, better do it, or hell, for real.
Okay, so let's hold that because that reads into this verse properly. So the content of the next verse, at this stage in the verse, we're reading it through the first time. We have no idea what this is about, right? We have no idea about Brit Milah or anything. But yes, it without giving away too much, many commentators read the Vayev Hagesh Hamito as a threat, which once the requirements have been taken care of, the threat will subside. Yeah, which by the way is an interesting mirroring to what's going to be happening. The very mission that God is sending Moshe on with Pharaoh is to threaten death unless he does something, right? So some people read this as a weirdo 3-verse microcosm in the inverse of what Moshe is about to represent to Pharaoh of God's intentions. Moshe is actually experiencing a version of it, and regarding a child. Rick?
Okay, hi. So a couple of things. Let me remind us that the Vayivakesh, we had that verb just a couple verses ago where God tells Moses that there's nobody there trying to kill you anymore. There's no Anashim.
Good.
But meanwhile, there's me still. But it's a weird way for God to describe things. Let me also say that when people got sick in the ancient world, they thought it was a punishment from God, that because God causes everything. And if you get sick, if you're healthy, that's because God wants it that way, right? So let me also remind the class that we got bani here, bincha, sorry, 2 banis and a bincha. And Tzipporah is there also. She's within earshot, just like Sarah was with Abraham and everybody, Rachel was with Jacob. They could hear the conversation going on about the idols and stuff like that. So I only bring it up again because I read it a few weeks ago of all the verses, of all the aliyot. They gave me this one in Bo to read about the circumcision after Passover. The himol there gets the dargah. It stands out, and the word hagar is in there, the stranger, and the lager. And so my crazy idea is that Sipporah heard that, and here we have Gershom, and they haven't done the circumcision yet. So she knows that it's going to be part of the holiday, and so he's gotten sick for some reason, and that's all connected. So I don't know how to say that better than that, but those are the ideas that I got.
Good. There's no way to say that better than that. You said it exactly as it should be said. Wonderful, Rick.
Thanks.
Before I go to David, let's hear David, and then I want to share something on the screen that links back to something that Barry said before Barry speaks again. So David, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the sought to kill maybe represents some sort of moral struggle that's going on because Moses is not comfortable with the concept of slaying the firstborn. And so, God is threatening him or trying to change his mind. Yeah,
so interesting. Yet another way of imagining this scene as presaging or predicting or preparing Moshe for the encounters that Moshe is going to have with Pharaoh. It's hard to know because, if we wipe all that away, we've kind of implied this. But let's just say it. It's a crazy verse. It's a crazy verse that Moshe, particularly if we follow the basic order, Moshe is about to be sent in as God's messenger to free the people, and the verse is telling us that God sought to slay him. It is a crazy verse. So trying to figure out in what way this verse is connected to the things that happen or are coming up, we can't not try that, because otherwise it's such an odd non sequitur, an odd plot line, right? So it's interesting to imagine, right, Moshe as, we've discussed Moshe the reluctant prophet, maybe Moshe the reluctant child threatener, right? And how God how God turns Moshe into someone who's willing to actually say those words. Let me share something before Barry speaks again, because it connects to the thing that Barry said before. If you look at Onkelos on the page, and then we'll look at the screen. So Onkelos translates the word. He does actually a bunch of interesting things. First of all, he translates the word malon into two, because vayahi becomes vahava, baderach becomes be'archa, like orech chaim, the pathway of life, and then takes the single word bamalon and turns it into two Aramaic words, bevet mevata, right? So in some ways this pushes closer to what you were saying before, Barry, that it's a structure, because otherwise the word bait wouldn't be there. But look at the word mevata in Aramaic. According to Jastrow, it's from the root boot, which I forgot actually what the word boot means. We could look it up in a second. but it refers to a night lodging, and in other places it refers to the structure of the night lodging, right? The here it's hammock, like the little thing you put out for your night sleep. So it could be that it's a structure where other people are, or it could be you've established that this is your place overnight, and so it's called a beit mavuta and not necessarily a house where many other people are. Let me remind myself what boot means in Aramaic. To go in, to lodge, to pass the night. Yeah. I guess it's related to bayit. I guess I never thought about that the word bayit actually being connected to a word that means nighttime and passing a night, but that makes sense. Okay, Barry, please.
So I guess three things on this lodging place. Going in implies that possibly that someone else has created this. Not that I put up my place.
Yeah. If the ba means in, and remember ba can also mean at, and they're shades of one another, but at does not necessarily mean inside. Keep going.
Going back to this confrontation, and then Tzipporah taking action. So what is the nature of this confrontation? Is this in God's intention, God's mindset, or is this a physical that Tzipporah sees in this encounter? And what is the action from God that Tzipporah is aware of from which she takes a reaction?
Great question. So Barry's anticipating the next verse, which we all kind of know is happening.
Before she can take action, she must be aware of God's action potential.
Great. It's a great question. What we are learning something in verse 24 as the reader, given insight to the author's full mind, right? But what is manifest in that verse such that we should read the next verse as a reaction to it, because it makes sense that it is a reaction to it. Well, we'll get there in a second, but Tzipporah does something, and it doesn't make sense for Tzipporah to have done something randomly. Tzipporah must have done something in response, and so Barry's asking, what is the matter? Not what's the matter, but what is the material of Vayevakesh Hamito that God sought, intended, proposed, made a suggestion that God kill Moshe, such that Tzipporah knew about it, right? That would be another challenging thing to stage. Is it God coming down from the heavens and saying out loud, I'm going to kill Moshe? Is it God in the pose that Abraham is over Isaac with a sword? Is there something metaphysical going on that somehow Tzipporah is just aware of it? Really good question, Barry.
Third, we brought up the parallel to Jacob and Esau. And that's the night that Jacob wrestles, and the result of his wrestling, he now has the strength, we might say, to do what he is going to be doing. And in this regard, in this matter, what you call it, Moshe is being transformed into the strength that he needs, that he's going to do.
Good connection. Diane Larry.
Here we are.
Okay. We may have a screaming baby in the background.
That's okay.
Happy screams.
Well, that's appropriate for this scene.
Yeah, I guess so. So I want to build on something Rick said, because I'm going to look at this in some very simplistic way, which is to say that maybe to Bikesh Hamito is someone who gets ill to the point of death, like he's about to meet his maker. And so in primitive societies, there were maybe all kinds of ways of appeasing the gods in order to prevent your death. In the same way that today we change people's names who are on the verge of death. Maybe this was some kind of a rite. There had to be blood. I don't know, but But if you think about it as just, not that even though beforehand Moshe has encountered God as a character with a conversation and everything, maybe this is just simply Moshe got really sick on the way to Egypt.
It's really fascinating, Diane. Let me hear what Larry said, then I want to respond to what you're saying, Diane.
We hadn't talked about it. I'm going to say something somewhat similar, but just a couple of quick comments. People have connected this to the previous verse, but the previous verse, the verb was horeg and not death. Here is hamito. So they're completely different. I'm always looking for the explanation for why the story is told like it's told, and I tend to think we make way too much of this story. And so I'll just say what I'm going to say. In 1976, I got malaria really bad and almost died. I wanted to die. I asked to die. I saw God, not really, but I saw my death. I thought I was already dead. That's what's happening here in verse 14, is at night, Moses, assume the subject here is Moses. Moses actually encountered God because he was about to die. And Moses, asked for his death. He was so sick, he asked for his death. So his wife, using a rite that primitive people use all the time to try to use blood to take away the death. And I learned a word from Alter, who has like a whole page on this thing, which he never, ever, ever does. She uses a apotropaic approach, which means
apotropaic.
Fending off evil. So she circumcises her son. Which son? Oldest son? Not sure. Because she knows that's a way of drawing a lot of blood without actually harming him, and needed to be done anyways. And then she throws this at Moses' feet. As a way of trying to cure this particular illness, right? And then when God let Moses alone, in other words, he was now back from being sick, she then makes this statement, which I can't really explain.
An incantation.
An incantation.
Yeah.
So that's, to me, is the simplest explanation of what's going on here. But I'll stop there because we haven't gotten to the other two verses.
Yeah. Really, really interesting stuff. I want to let most of what you said just stand. The one thing I want to respond to and what Diane said is, in some ways, this is a brutal scene. And in some ways, circumcision to this day, even those of us who are fully or mostly fully committed to it, is a brutal thing to witness. And as we think about the korbanot, the sacrifices in antiquity, it must have been an incredible, and not necessarily from our moral and visual standards, easy thing to witness, particularly those of us who don't eat meat, but even those of us who do eat meat. A lot of people have written about how the Brit Milah on the one hand and the sacrifice of animals on the other hand should be understood less as a kind of a horrific brutality, but a tremendous evolution from a society where the children were not getting circumcised, but getting slaughtered, and where appeasing God was not slaughtering an animal that was going to be consumed as part of your nutrition, but slaughtering a human, slaughtering a child. And so there may be some of that directly or indirectly in this verse, that if you want to see this verse as an appeasement, as an incantation to appease a god or to heal a Moshe who had a terrible case of malaria. I really like your potential read, Larry, that the subject of Vayivakesh is Moshe, that he sought his own death. Like I'll linger with that. That this was a relatively cheap way of going about that, rather than thinking that the way to appease the god is to kill the child, or to draw blood that is actually going to be devastating. Now, how to make that all work with the next two verses, I don't know, because we are lingering on this verse because that's our method to do a verse at a time. We're going to have to, once we finish verse 25 and 26, which we're going to take some time because this is the verse that we're on is the easiest of the three verses in language and in meaning. So this is going to take at least a few sessions. We're going to have to come back and now try to remake sense of verse 24 based on the content that 25 and 26 tells us. But I should have even said less than that. Great comments, Larry, Diane. Norm and Rachel.
I have a very different reading also. God had told Moshe that there is no one left in Egypt that's still interested in killing him. But we should know that Pharaoh's son certainly would still remember him. They sort of grew up together, probably. And he would still remember Moshe and probably be interested in killing him, especially if he has an inkling that his life is being threatened, which perhaps he does. And when God says there's nobody in Egypt still after you, Moshe, it implies to me that Pharaoh's son is not in Egypt. Where he is, we don't know. Maybe he's on some sort of a rumspringa or...
What was that word?
Rumspringa is something that Amish teenagers do when they go a weekend or a week or a month or whatever to go wild. What Pharaoh's son is doing, I don't know. But apparently he's traveling, perhaps on the road between Midian and Egypt, perhaps in the Sinai, wandering about. What he's doing, hunting or whatever, we don't know. But perhaps he comes across Moshe. He has an incentive to attempt to kill him. He attempts to kill him, and that relates back to our previous verse perfectly, because as I think Larry previously noted, maybe it was Rick, the end of the previous sentence, the previous verse, had a him who was Pharaoh's son. And so perhaps it's Pharaoh's son who attempts to kill Moshe.
Yeah. So with the imprecise or at least pluripotent pronouns and the word perhaps, which is a great word, these verses can mean anything, right? Like, and I don't say that facetiously, because some of Midrash is exactly that, saying, well, since it can mean anything, what's my working fantasy as to what this verse can mean? And there are some fantastical interpretations of scenes in the Torah that are far more fantastical than what Norm just represented. And the Rashi that we're going to read, was it this verse? I think the Rashi on this verse is going to be stranger than that. So if you're listening to what Norm says and say that can't make any sense, wait till Rashi brings down the Midrash on how a certain group of rabbis read this verse. I don't remember, Norm, how did you make sense of the Adonai and Vayifkashehu Adonai, if that's your reading of it?
I'm putting the last two words as a completely separate phrase.
Got it. He's out seeking to meet God, and by the by, that son from the previous verse sought to execute Moshe. Okay, right. Interesting. Okay, Leonard, Rebecca.
All right, so my comment was more relevant 15 minutes ago, but
resurrected.
Anyway, we looked at the Onkelos on the first half of the verse, but if you look at the Onkelos on the second half of the verse, you can see that he throws in an entirely new word that's not in the Hebrew.
Malach.
Malach. It says Malach da Adonai. So he talks about the angel of God instead of saying that God is doing this. So I'm just going to throw that out there.
Very good, right? So where Rashi is going to play with that a little bit in the sense that when Rashi it brings his commentary into these verses, it seems to be an encounter not between Moshe and God and Moshe and a Malach, and that may have Onkelos' interpolation may have influenced Rashi, or Onkelos' interpolation may have just represented how the Jews at that time understood this verse to be, that it's Vayifkashehu Adonai, but that this is not a direct threat of execution by God to Moshe, but via an angel, particularly because we've been having a lot of angels in our scenes.
I said that in particular for Rick's benefit, since I know he likes angels.
Yeah. Thank you. Joanna.
So back again, kind of in my mind, pulling together a few different things that have been said. One is the confusion about the pronouns in this verse. Two is Larry's very intriguing comment about when he had malaria. And and to me, like, given Larry's comment, there's a disconnect between God wanting to try to kill Moshe and then doing something to the son because of that. And I'm also looking at the etnachta in this verse and where it separates the verse, and wondering if almost you can separate this verse into two completely separate clauses. So far, we've been looking at verse 24 as an introduction to what's going to happen in verses 25 and 26. But I'm also wondering if there's a possible read where it's the introduction to also the following scene that starts in verse 27 of the encounter between Moshe and Aharon. In that, is it possible that Vayhi Baderech Bamalon is he, Moshe, was on the way to the Malone? That's happening in one scene. In another scene, separate and apart from that, Vayifkashehu Adonai encounters one of the sons of Moshe and tries to kill that son. And then, as the verses continue, there's two cameras in two different places. There's a camera with Zipporah, and we see what's happening there. And then the camera shifts to Moshe.
Sure, maybe, perhaps, right? I'm struck as I was thinking about the content of what Joanna said, just to jump up an analytical level. This is, I suppose, true every time this class meets, but particularly it's ringing true to me now. This is the yeshiva of Pumbedita in the 3rd century. What we're doing right now, these are Jews who care about this text, doing everything they can to try to wring meaning from it and to make sense of it. And I just think that some of the conversations that we are having on the text of the Torah, some of the highest level explorations of the meaning of Torah that are happening in a standard synagogue adult ed class, pretty much anywhere. It's really fascinating to hear all of your applying what you know about the Hebrew language and sometimes ancient history and grammar and your literary skills and imagining different ways of weaving these things together based on where the commas and semicolons are. This is the process that we really have inherited from our spiritual ancestors, and I'd like to think that it would make Rav Papa proud, as it were. So sure, that's a fascinating possibility and very in line with how we've been dealing with this whole set of texts, which is seeing if we can stitch them together slightly differently than how they are presented to us. Let's hear from Rick, and then we'll go back and read the Rashi and see if we can get through at least part of the Rashi before the end of class today.
Just real quick, it's a question more. The Malone, besides malaria, which sounds the same, Malone and La Mulot, are there any, the two-letter root, three-letter root, are there any relations to Malone and Mulot?
It's alliterative or assonant, depending on which word you choose.
Yeah, but that's it.
But that's it. The mulot, the root is mem lamed hey, lamul, to circumcise, to cut around, and malon, the mem of malon is part of the structure of the noun, like michtav is a letter, but the root is katav. So the root of malon is lamed vav nun or lamed yud nun. So the nun is integral to the word malon. The mem is integral to the word milah. The only letter they really share is a lamed. So it's not enough, I think, to draw a connection of meaning, but it's certainly lyrical to hear it being said. Okay. Matt, let's go see what Rashi has to say about this. Now that we've done a good amount of surgery on ourselves, Rashi has an extremely short comment on this verse and then a wacko longer comment on it. And excuse my referring to Rashi as wacko. Okay.
Vayhi Moshe Baderech Bamalon. And the word he explains is Vayhi. He explains it by saying Vayhi, if I understand it correctly.
Well, what's
his point?
Hold on. What word are you seeing? Are you looking at a different version of Rashi than I am? What's the word that Rashi says?
I see two entries. The first one is like a one-word entry. Vayehi Moshe b'derech b'malon, and then it gives the word Vayehi.
Right.
The next one is the longer one, Vayevakesh Hamito.
Right. So the first thing Rashi does is basically throw in the word Moshe as a subject to the word Vayehi in between.
I see. I'm on a different page. You're right. So he's adding the word Moshe. Okay.
Right. So Rashi. So the first comment Rashi had done is write a word. I'd like, by the way, one day to submit a taste of Torah for Temple Beth Am, and it's just going to be one word, and have people like spend an hour trying. What did Rabbi Kligfeld mean? Just a single word. Right. You have to reach a certain level to be able to say something with a word. But joking aside, assuming that Rashi is saying something, right? Or we often use this term, disabusing us of a notion that we would have had he not said this, right? And it's not just having like a word burp.
Right.
Why is Rashi adding the word Moshe? What does he not want us to think this verse might mean? Who else could have been the Vayehi? This may go back to what you were saying, Joanna, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think we've touched on this before. There's various possibilities.
Good.
It could be Pharaoh's son. It could be who knows who.
So it could be referring to the fact, as many of you said, that the previous antecedent is Pharaoh's son, not Moshe. It could be Rashi being aware that he knows the Larry Herman work, and that this verse really follows verse 20 and not verse 23. There could be many possibilities, but with one word, he's telling the reader, all of your other fantasies about what this is, no, it's Moshe. What it means is that this is seen as happening to Moshe. Joanna?
What's fascinating to me, what jumped out to me as soon as that was read out loud, is we're so steeped in the tradition that as much as we're debating what this verse could possibly mean, I mean, we've been anticipating this scene for so long that we're reading verse 24 as an introduction to something, to one or two of the following scenes. I think there's a possible read, like if you've never encountered Torah before and you've just read verse 23 and you're reading verse 24 for the first time, who is on their way to the hotel? It's Paro. And who's the son who's in danger? Paro's son, because God just said he was going to kill Paro's son. So this is sort of, immediately shifting for the reader. Okay, now we're back to focusing on Moshe. We're not talking about Paro here.
Great, Joanne. You're almost saying that rather than Rashi's commenting on verse 24 to help us understand something backwards, it's helping us understand something forward, lest you think that this scene is immediately following this threat of killing Pharaoh's son. A reminder that the threat to killing Pharaoh's son, and I know this is a subtlety, is a threat that is not yet been proffered. Right? It's like it's a quotation within a quotation. It's God's saying to Moshe what you will eventually say to Pharaoh, but it actually hasn't been proffered yet. So even if we finish verse 23, we're not yet at a place in our minds where you think that God is threatening Pharaoh's son, just that God is telling Moshe that eventually he's going to threaten Pharaoh's son. But sure, Rashi is telling us, in case you're wondering if any of that is what's going on here, we're back to Moshe. But it's amazing what he can do with a single word, right? Assuming that we are at all correct on what he's trying to do. Good. Anything else on the word Moshe? Otherwise, we can start reading the next Rashi. We might get through reading it. I imagine we're not going to get through discussing it. Anyone? Okay, Matt, you're going to enjoy this one, and you might even want to invoke our dear friend Arthur Stern for the first time in a long time, because he would have gone crazy on this one.
Oliver Shalom. All right. Hamalach, by the way, it's written in my version here. It says in parentheses, Hamalach, close parentheses, Moshe.
Right. So, some versions of Rashi have the word Hamalach. Some versions don't. And again, it goes back to Uncle is saying is the subject here of the one who wanted to kill Moshe. Is it God directly or God through a malach? And even the versions of Rashi don't agree with one another.
All right. So parentheses, the angel, close parentheses, to Moshe. Lefi Shalom Mal et Eliezer Beno, since he did not circumcise Eliezer his son. Shenitrashel ne'enash mita, and because he failed, he was to be punished with death.
Okay, so if we pause there, what we've got so far is that the reason why Moshe's life is threatened is because apparently he did not do a bris for his second son, Eliezer. Okay. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts, comments on that before we keep going in the Rashi? Just anyone not clear as to what's happening so far in this scene or in the scene in the Midrash? Okay.
Okay. Tanya Amar Rabbi Yossi. So according to the commentary, Rabbi Yossi said,
I'm going to pause. For those of you who studied some Talmud and Mishnah before, and all of you said a lot of Rashi, this is a very strange formulation of Rashi, right? So let's remind ourselves. Most of the time, Rashi gives us his answer without even hinting that he took it from a Midrash, even though we know it. Occasionally, Rashi will say, umidrasho, or v'yesh dorshim, and making it very clear that he's taking from a source. He almost never uses the vocabulary of the Midrash or the Talmudic text in his answer. The word Tanya is a technical term. Tanya is a word that appears in the Talmud that tells us that we are learning a source from the Mishnaic era that didn't get included in the Mishnah, right? There's a whole volume of material called the Braitot, the external texts, and it's a technical term. You find it on every page of the Talmud. But Rashi almost never introduces technical language, even when he's telling us very clearly he's borrowing this from Midrashic literature. I have no idea why he's doing it here. He could have started with Amar Rabbi Yossi. He's really quoting a Midrash in full, and that's just an odd thing, at least in terms of how Rashi normally does his annotations. Keep going.
Chas v'shalom lo nitrashel ela amar amo ve'tzei derech. So heaven forbid, he didn't. It's not that he failed. It's rather that he said, "I will do the circumcision, and I will go off on my trip."
And there's an implied question mark there, Matt. Meaning,
okay. Oh, okay. So, did he say, I will? Maybe did he say, and then that I will circumcise, and then I'll go on a trip?
Close. Rabbi Yossi says, lest you think of Moshe as someone who was going to reject circumcision. What his sin was saying, Amul, I'm going to circumcise him, ve'etzei derech, and I'm just going to take him on a trip after circumcising him. Sakanahi.
Yeah, there's a danger there, of course, to the child until the third day, and I will esehehu gimel yamim, and I'll take him for 3 days.
So put a question mark, exclamation point after the Shlosha Yamim. That's one thing Moshe said to himself. He said to himself, what, I'm going to circumcise him and then take him on a trip?
Right.
It would be dangerous to my son for 3 days. Or what's my other possibility? Moshe says to himself, Amul.
I'll circumcise him, and then I'll go for 3 days.
No, Eshe. What does Shohem mean in Hebrew?
I'll stay. Sorry, I'll stay remain for 3 days. God ordered me to return to Egypt.
Another question mark, exclamation point. So Rabbi Yossi is imagining Moshe saying, I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. Mm-hmm. Either I circumcise him because I haven't yet, and then take him on this trip that's going to be dangerous to him, or I circumcise and I wait 3 days, right? It takes a while to recover from the circumcision. Most of us didn't walk for a year after that, right? But then I'm violating God's command who said, get going.
Okay. Right. Okay. And so why was he punished?
Add another word. I
don't have mita.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But that's fine. Punished with death. Because he busied himself with the night place first.
Right. So this Midrash is trying to make camp.
he made camp first.
This midrash is trying to make very specific sense of why the word malon appears in the verse. That it's that malon word that got Moshe in trouble. So if Moshe couldn't win here because neither choice was really okay, to endanger his son or to delay God's wishes, then why was he punished, right? And this, by the way, is also presaging the situation that Pharaoh is going to be in, where he's going to be punished for something that he may not have any choice in. So notice that pre-parallel as well, because he went on the way, and instead of doing the mitzvah first, he made sure that he had to upgrade to a suite. Nitasik malon tchila.
Right. Okay. According to Mechelta.
Okay. And then pause here, because the next part is where Rashi goes into a more fantastical place, and maybe we'll pick up on that next week. Comments or questions on the part of the Rashi that Matt just read? I saw some comments in the chat, but I haven't had a chance to read them yet.
Oh, yes, the next part is amazing. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So we'll give that to you next week also if you want. Joanna.
I do find it fascinating that if the read is that this is in reference to Eliezer and not Gershom, that we have never encountered Eliezer's name in the text yet. We have never been informed of his birth. And like here he is in this seemingly pivotal scene, and we actually don't know of his existence. Like he's never named. Right. So I was waiting for someone to say that, because unless we really have a precise memory of when we're told things in the Torah, we know that Moshe has two sons. We're going to meet them both in Parshat Yitro, but as of now, there's only Gershom. Right? So Rashi is bringing a midrash that says that it must have been that Eliezer was just born. We didn't hear about it because there was a burning bush. Right? He comes back from the burning bush, and all of a sudden there's a baby. Right? And that's why we hadn't heard of his birth. And there was a mitzvah, an obligation of confronting Moshe, and he shirked it or didn't know which way to handle it. And it's a blood mitzvah, right? And it's a mitzvah having to do with spiritual life and death, which places it kind of properly in the scene, given what's at stake for Moshe and what's at stake for the people that Moshe is about to confront. Okay. Are there any commentators that see this as a reference to Gershom, that it was Gershom who wasn't circumcised and not Eliezer? Whenever a question begins, are there any? The answer is almost always yes, but I'm not aware of one, right? And I don't think there's any on our page on the classic Mikro Dolot. Maybe between now and next week, I'll see if I can find one. Last comment, Leonard, Rebecca, and then we'll end because we're at 9:30.
Sorry, my phone was ringing. I actually, I found it so strange that Zipporah was the one who did the circumcision rather than Moshe, the father. So I looked in a women's commentary book that Leonard had given me years ago, and I see the midrash about it being Gershom, that because according to the agreement that Moshe and Zipporah had when they got married, they were going to raise half the children as Midianites. And so Gershom, as the first, belonged to Zipporah. He wasn't circumcised, and he was raised as a Midianite. He was named, I'll be a stranger in the land. And so the story then, according to this, goes that that's, why Zipporah then, in seeing that, this is about the circumcision, I'm going to circumcise him so that he won't be a stranger when he goes back to the homeland. I also, Zipporah, won't be a stranger anymore. And so that it was really because of Gershom countering his being raised as a Midianite that she was now going to remedy this. Fascinating. Thank you. A great place to end. When we meet next week, we'll jump into part 2 of this Rashi.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.